Newsnight has seen a leaked report which suggests that the government may be heading for a major embarrassment over its continued support for British arms sales to Saudi Arabia. Over the past year, our reporter Gabriel Gatehouse has repeatedly documented the targeting of civilians and civilian infrastructure, including factories and hospitals, in the Saudi-led bombing campaign in Yemen. And yet, as late as yesterday, the Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson defended British arms sales to Saudi Arabia for use in Yemen, saying the campaign is not in clear breach of international humanitarian law. But as Gabriel has now learned, that Commons Committee of Arms Experts Controls takes a very different and damning view. What's the story?
Well, Kirsty, a bit of background to this. In July this year, on the last day of Parliament before the summer recess, in what's known as Take Out the Trash Day, the day when the government releases potentially embarrassing information, the Foreign Office made a rather startling admission when it had said over a period of 6 months that the government had assessed that Saudi Arabia wasn't in breach of international humanitarian law in Yemen. It admitted it had made no such assessment at all. It had in fact relied on Saudi assertions. Now, you mentioned Boris Johnson's continued support for arms sales to Saudi Arabia, saying there wasn't enough evidence to suggest that Saudi Arabia was committing war crimes. Well, this report from the Committee on Arms Export Control, it's a draft report, but it concludes the opposite. It says that the weight of evidence is now so great that the UK should suspend arms sales to Saudi Arabia for use in Yemen until an independent and international inquiry can establish the truth. Now, both sides in this conflict have been accused of committing war crimes, but the UN says 60% of the civilian casualties are caused by Saudi-led airstrike. This programme, as you said, has highlighted the targeting of civilians. We were in Yemen last year, seeing that, and we travelled then with our colleague from the Arabic service, Nawal Al-Maghafi. She's just been back to Yemen for a documentary for Our World. She's come back, and here is some of what she found.
Yemen has been under constant bombardment for the last 18 months. A conflict between Houthi rebels and a Saudi-led coalition. Both sides have been accused of war crimes, but it is the Saudis that the UK and its Western allies are backing. I was in Houthi-held territory in Abs in northern Yemen 3 weeks ago, when a nearby Médecins Sans Frontières hospital was hit by a Saudi airstrike. This footage was filmed by local residents immediately after the attack, which ended up killing 19 people.
All the patients were at ease. Some were sleeping. There were sleeping children and there were mothers giving birth. There were no problems at all. There were no Houthis or any armed people in the hospital. Only the doctors and nurses who work here.
At around 4 p.m. in the afternoon, patients, doctors, nurses here could hear aeroplanes flying overhead. They didn't think it would strike, not only because this is a residential area, but because this is a hospital. But an airstrike did hit right over here by the emergency room, killing at least 15 people.
People lost their jobs and homes. All of this is nothing compared to the loss of people's life. They are innocent. Who is responsible for what is happening to us?
Saudi Arabia claims that the targeting of the hospital was a mistake. But MSF insists that all parties to the conflict have been provided with clear GPS coordinates of the hospital's location.
It is markings for the coalition to know it's a hospital. They were fully aware, and we contact them on a daily basis and tell them of MSF's whereabouts. And this logo is painted on the roof to differentiate this building from all other buildings. And yet they still bombed this hospital.
19-year-old Ayman was a local MSF volunteer. He had just driven his ambulance through the hospital gates when the airstrike hit. He and the patients in the back of his ambulance were all killed.
He came home at 1 p.m. to have lunch and went back to work. At 3 o'clock we heard the bombing of the airstrike. I was screaming, "My son, my son, my son." They told me he was in the hospital. Someone else said he was in the ambulance, so I ran there myself. I found my son underneath the cupboards, completely burnt, like a piece of coal.
This was the fourth MSF hospital to have been destroyed in this conflict. The charity has now withdrawn from northern Yemen. The country's infrastructure has been devastated. Meanwhile, nearly 4,000 Yemeni civilians have been killed and another 6,000 injured.
That was Nahal Al-Maghafi's report there. So exactly what is in the committee report?
Well, the committee is made up of MPs from 4 other select committees: Defence, Foreign Affairs, International Development and Business, all the committees that are involved in the export of arms. Now, this copy that we've got hold of is a draft. The committee will meet tomorrow to discuss possible changes, so we don't know what the final language is going to sound like. But as it stands, the report says that the weight of evidence of violations of international humanitarian law by the Saudi-led coalition in Yemen is now so great that it is very difficult to continue to support Saudi Arabia while maintaining the credibility of our arms licensing regime. Now, in the summary, it says that given the scale and the history of UK arms exports to Saudi Arabia, it is, quote, inevitable, it seems inevitable, that any violations of international law by the Saudi-led coalition would involve arms supplied by the UK. And the fact that the government has not supported efforts to establish an independent international inquiry, the report says, quote, has allowed for the transfer of items to Saudi Arabia, very possibly in contravention of the UK's legal obligations. And while doubt and uncertainty about IHL compliance in Yemen exists, the default position of the UK government should not be to continue to sell weapons, i.e. to suspend weapons sales.
So what does the law say about this?
So the law says that licences must not be granted where there is a clear risk that items might be used in the commission of serious violations of international humanitarian law. That's quite broad. The question is whether, as the government contends, there is insufficient evidence to support that. This report concludes that there's ample evidence. Now, the government says it has one of the strictest licensing regimes anywhere in the world, although since the conflict began, it hasn't refused a single export license to Saudi Arabia. This is what the draft report has to say on the matter. We have found that the government's arms export licensing regime, which it repeatedly asserts is robust, is in fact to a large extent opaque, and the government too often relies on assertion rather than positive evidence.
But what weight does the committee report actually have, will have, when it comes out?
Well, the committee has weight, but it doesn't have the power to force the government to change policy. It does have the power to force it to come and explain itself in front of the committee. But there's another thing going on. There's a legal case. The campaign group Campaign Against the Arms Trade is taking the government to court over its arms sales to Saudi Arabia. It will go to judicial review. There'll be a hearing early next year. And I've spoken to their lawyers this evening. They've told me that they've written to the MOD and the FCO urgently seeking clarification about these assertions that they'd assessed, the government had assessed that Saudi Arabia wasn't in breach of international humanitarian law. They say that the government has apparently placed inaccurate and misleading statements before the court. They haven't yet heard back.
Gabriel, thanks very much indeed.